start of a new week of Newsnight, now on BBC Two, with Emily Maitlis.
John Bercow is the new Speaker, but is he the right man to clean up the House of Commons? Tonight he won a clear majority in the House, but how many of his own side were that pleased? Labour MPs cheered him to his feet, but look at the Tories here. Crossed arms, little applause. Despite threats from the Supreme Leader and protesters' deaths, demonstrations on the streets of Iran go on.
Evidence will be held in private. In this way, also evidence given by serving and former ministers, military officers and officials will, I believe, be as full and as candid as possible.
Well, that was last week. Tonight, a U-turn on the Iraq inquiry. Gordon Brown says he welcomes it being held in public. And meet the big beast in our very own Dragon's Den. They'll talk about spending cuts, even if our own politicians dare not.
Welcome to Newsnight's Politics Pen, where our political animals are sharpening their claws, ready to tear the fat from the body politic.
Hello, good evening. I don't want to be something, I want to do something. John Bercow told the Commons this afternoon he bid MPs not to judge his youth, not to reject him because he wasn't actually senile. They listened, it appears, and 2 hours ago, Mr Bercow became the first Conservative Speaker of the House for 16 years. It was Conservatives, though, that looked least delighted by the news. Tonight, opposition leaders told him he must be the catalyst for radical change. So, is he a unifier? Is he the right man for the job? Let's cross to Michael Crick, our political editor, who spent the day embroiled in this curious voting process in Westminster. Michael.
Well, tonight, members of Parliament have elected a Conservative MP as their new Speaker. But also tonight, people on both sides of the House are saying this is really a victory for Labour. John Bercow began his political career on the right in the Monday Club, but more recently he's been regarded as a very left-wing Conservative MP. It was widely rumoured a couple of years ago he was about to join the Labour Party. His wife is a strong Labour Party supporter. And there must be severe questions about whether he can sustain his speakership beyond the next election. But this is the result as it was announced a couple of hours ago.
Order, order. This is the result of the third ballot. 593 ballots were cast. The number of votes cast for each candidate was as follows. John Bercow, 322. Yes! Sir George Young, 271.
Then the 157th Speaker of the Commons was dragged to the chair in an ancient ritual dating from the days when speakers had to show some reluctance and held the post at risk to their lives. In 2009, it looked somewhat inappropriate, for no candidate can have sought this job more keenly than John Bercow.
If elected, a Speaker has a responsibility immediately and permanently to cast aside all of his or her previous political views. I said it, and
he's had quite a few views over the years.
I said it, and I meant it.
Tonight was the climax of a long and dramatic day, beginning with candidate speeches. Presiding over a packed Commons was the father of the House, its longest-serving MP, Alan Williams. Margaret Beckett, with the most experience of government, but the least as a backbencher, spoke first.
Such skills as I have acquired in my years in this House would, if elected, be at the service of this House and all its members, and that I am particularly conscious of the Speaker's responsibility to backbenchers.
Sir George Young.
Sir George Young, who lost last time, made the best speech, telling MPs the House had to regain its self-confidence.
One of my concerns about recent events with the anger from a failed expenses system exposed by the media has been the emergence of a bidding war to be tough that risks losing sight of the basic principles of justice that this House has always defended. Mr. Williams, I want to see a House of Commons that regains its self-confidence. I want a more independent House of Commons, a more effective House of Commons, a more relevant House of Commons, and a more accessible House of Commons.
John Bercow began with a light-hearted reference to his lack of support on his own Conservative benches.
One of my first approaches was to a particularly distinguished colleague whom I wouldn't dream of identifying. I asked if he'd back me today. Certainly not, Bercow. You're not just too young, you're far too young. Given that, in my judgment, the Speaker ought to be virtually senile.
A brilliant impression there of what everyone knew was Tory grandee Sir Peter Tapsell, though Tapsell himself denied saying that.
The Speaker should always be neutral within this chamber, but he or she should not be neutral about this chamber. If elected, I would be a tireless advocate for our political relevance. So finally, I turn to the world beyond Westminster. A reforming Speaker needs to become both an advocate and an ambassador for Parliament. He must reconnect it with the society which it seeks to represent. I would be comfortable to be both a Speaker and a listener.
At the vote, Mr Bercow, as expected, led the first round comfortably, with Sir George Young second, then Margaret Beckett, Sir Alan Hazelhurst, Sir Alan Beath and Anne Widdecombe. Sir Michael Lord was forced out with fewest votes, along with three more who got less than 5% of the vote. Nobody was eliminated at this stage, and I began to feel John Bercow might be slipping behind.
The surprising thing on that first vote was how badly Margaret Beckett did. And it's now looking as if the final runoff will be between John Bercow and Sir George Young, with most MPs I've spoken to thinking at this stage Sir George has the slight edge.
Order, order. This is the result of the second ballot.
In the second round, Bercow and Young both increased their votes, while the other four contenders fell back. Anne Widdecombe was now eliminated, and Alan Williams made a small plea.
I invite, almost beg, any candidate who wishes... I'm getting older. I invite any candidate who wishes to withdraw to inform me, please, in the chamber within the next 10 minutes.
Beckett, Hazelhurst and Beath all then duly withdrew, leaving a straight fight between Young and Bercow.
Now suddenly everything's changed. It seems John Bercow has the slight edge. Certainly Bercow supporters are a lot more optimistic now, Young supporters a lot less so. And it's clear from the figures that some Conservative MPs have started switching to Mr Bercow. Indeed, in the last 5 minutes, a couple of them admitted to me that they've done so. People I hadn't expected.
And so it proved, as John Bercow was elected Speaker quite comfortably, by a margin of 51. But tonight, as he went in procession to get assent from the Lords and the Queen, it's clear the results left a bitter taste amongst many Conservatives. The party which could well form the next government within a year.
Well, that was Michael Crick. Let's pick up with him now, still in Westminster. Michael, do you think he'll make it, with all those caveats, past the next election?
Well, I think if you talk to the Bercow camp, they admit that even on the final ballot, they may not have got more than 30 Conservative MPs. There's an amusing story I was told today by a Labour MP who was standing next to David Cameron in the Gents. And while they were having a pee together, the Labour MP turned to Cameron and said, you know, I voted for a Conservative today for the first time in my life. And Cameron said, John Bercow, that doesn't really count. Well, tonight what was interesting is how David Cameron tried to lead his benches in applauding Bercow. And I think that what Bercow needs to do is to weld together, really, his professed belief in modernisation with David Cameron's belief in modernisation. And although we live in an era where party leaders seem to be deposed every other week, and the Speaker as well a few weeks ago, my own hunch is that even if the Conservatives get a majority after the next election, there may be mutterings about a challenge, but my own hunch is it won't happen.
Michael Crick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining me now, Kelvin, Mackenzie, former Sun editor, Parmjit Dhanda, the youngest contender for Speaker you saw earlier, and Douglas Carswell, who called for the previous Speaker to step down. And thanks all very much for coming in. Douglas Carswell, you started this whole ball rolling. Are you pleased with the result?
Well, Parliament and the Commons is still in a hole, but at least we've stopped digging. We now have a Speaker who I think is committed to reform. He wasn't my first choice, but he's committed to reform. I hope we now see some really radical change.
Was he your second choice?
He was, yes. My first choice was Richard Shepherd. Unfortunately, he went out in the first round. I voted for John Bercow because I very much hope that he's going to be effective as Speaker at holding a future Conservative government to account.
You seem to be alone, dare we say, on your side of the bench. There weren't very many Tories looking happy at that choice tonight.
I voted for John Bercow because I think he's going to be effective at holding a future Conservative government to account. I hope that other people who voted for him voted for the same reason. Other Conservatives, it was a secret ballot, they voted for who they felt was the best candidate, but I think we have to accept the results.
Parmjit Dhanda, a Labour victory?
Well, I think people voted right the way across political dividing lines. I know people from my side who voted for Sir George Young. I know people who changed their vote. People voted for a whole range of reasons. I don't think it was actually a red-blue split, actually. A lot of it is down to relationships. People have known each other for very many years, sat on committees with each other. Sometimes it's just, you know, people that you get to know within Parliament, or sometimes it's due to the lobbying that's been happening over a period of time.
You said something very interesting in your speech. You said, we want people to thank us for this tomorrow. Will they?
I think John has got good credentials as a reformer. We'll be watching very carefully in the next 12 months that he does the things that he says he's going to do. But I think it's important that he's given the time and the opportunity to do that.
Everyone's been very cautious, Kelvin. I'm sure you won't be. Do you think when people look at this tomorrow, they will say, yes, this is a proper fresh start, we can begin again?
Well, I think most ordinary people will be puzzled by all this anyway, because if you look back 10 years ago, the appointment of the Speaker would have been lucky to have made 2 paragraphs on page 12 of The Sun. It was not an event of any kind. And I have my doubts about how big an event this is going to be. Bercow may want to do all kinds of things, but in the end he's going to have to carry the leadership of the Tory party and the Labour Party with him, and I'm not sure he can do that. And after all, he's got most people, ordinary people, the voter, are looking about this through expenses scandals. Now, if you take the Bible on this, the Daily Telegraph, they say that he was involved in flipping, and when asked, did you pay capital gains tax on your £300,000 gain, he said, I can't remember. Now, most of us, I think, can remember a capital gains tax. So my issue is he has a massive question mark over him, and I'm not sure that ordinary people will say, Bercow, oh, yes, he's the answer.
Douglas Carswell, does it matter that he comes with that particular millstone allegation?
Here's my second preference. I'm not here as part of his campaign team. What I would say is this. The House of Commons needs to begin a process of radical reform, and I think we need to, looking ahead over the next month, the next set of expenses that are going to be published, we need to make sure that we get this right. We need to begin the process of transparency, of real reform, of significant, substantial reform. Let's see if the new Speaker can lead on that.
Parmjit Dhanda, what has he got to do for that radical reform? To wake up the Sun readers, if you like, and say, wow, this is something we haven't seen before?
I think the Sun readers actually probably want to see somebody who's going to be a driver for change rather than just a referee at PMQs. Someone that actually does more than actually spends their time in the House, but actually tries to connect with the public. Now, the things that I was proposing were around actually involving the public in internet voting, deciding what the topical debate is, actually moving apparatus from Westminster out into the country. I hope John takes some of that on. But it was interesting. It was interesting to hear
Cameron. That was too
Cameron.
radical, right? So
maybe it was too radical, but it was interesting to hear Cameron today and Nick Clegg, and I think also Gordon Brown to some extent, actually say we want to give this guy his head to be a driver.
I've never heard so much cobblers in my life as their speeches. After all, it was only a week or so ago that they were saying what a shame it is that you're going, Michael Martin. How did this all happen? They're simply playing politics with it. They're saying to the voter, look, we're doing something. It's not very important, but it's got a lot of publicity around it. This is not a big deal being made Speaker of the House of Commons. You know that. You know that.
It hasn't been traditionally, but it could be.
A really interesting point in his speech, and he talked about, in essence, direct democracy. The idea that those we elect to represent us in politics are more accountable to us. And you suggested, and I loved it, the idea that we have a right of initiative. Ordinary people can decide what's on Parliament's agenda, what we as politicians do, what we vote on. This is the sort of agenda that I think people want to reconnect.
So what does that mean? Sort of appearing on Newsnight, appearing on GMTV, is that a connection, do you think?
Well, I honestly don't believe the Speaker can achieve anything without Cameron or who's going to replace Brown after the next election, right, saying, I agree with you. I don't think he can be a shop steward for 646 MPs and simply go to the leadership of the parties and say, this is what we want. And if we don't get it, then we're going to throw you out. Do you think that can happen?
He's the first Speaker who has real authority because he owes his position to the support of members of the legislature, not to government whips. That gives him a huge mandate for change. I think if he weds his reformist agenda to that of David Cameron, we could see some far-reaching radical change.
And if he doesn't, he's out, presumably, by the next election.
Well, let's see. Let's give the guy. Let's give him a chance. We've gone through a rough patch. We've got a reformist Speaker. He's got a clear mandate. Let's see what he does with it.
Parmjit, Dhanda.
Well, I think absolutely right. He's got to be a champion for the House, not necessarily a shop steward, a champion for it. But in order to actually champion the House, first you've got to change it. And I think he will be given his head to actually make some fairly radical reforms. And I hope that he is actually really radical and takes that opportunity.
In the autumn, I'm proposing a bill that would allow ordinary people to trigger by-elections if they're dissatisfied with their MP, or petition their returning officer so every voter has a say as to who the candidate is.
So you would be getting rid of him in 6 months' time?
That's not to get rid of speakers, it's to get rid of indolent and lazy MPs.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for coming in. For a profile of the career of John Bercow, do check out David Grossman's latest version of Village People on our website.